The sun is a white disk burning directly above, and there is no shadow anywhere. Your lips are cracked, salt crusts in the creases of your skin where sweat has dried and dried again. The sand stretches in every direction, pale, featureless, endless. You reach for the waterskins strapped to the camel's saddle, feeling the weight slosh inside, and you bring it to your face. But before it even touches your lips, you smell it. Something wrong, something sour. The water that was clear 2 days ago now carries a scent that makes your stomach turn. And in this place, under this sun, you face a truth that modern travelers rarely understand. Bad water is not an inconvenience. It is a death sentence wearing the disguise of relief. This is the nightmare that haunted every caravan crossing the great deserts of history, the Sahara, the Arabian Peninsula, the scorching basins of Central Asia. Water that looked safe but had turned. Water that would bring cramps, fever, and weakness precisely when strength meant survival. And yet, for centuries, these caravans moved across weeks of barren terrain, carrying their water in skins and clay and carved gourds, without refrigeration, without sealed plastic, without chemical purification tablets or laboratory testing. They arrived on the other side alive. The question is how? Most people assume the answer is simple endurance. They picture hardened desert people who could tolerate what would ruin softer travelers, drinking foul water and simply surviving through toughness. Others assume luck, that many caravans simply failed, and we only hear about the ones that made it. Both assumptions are wrong. The truth is more surprising and far more impressive. Desert caravans did not rely on superhuman tolerance or fortunate odds. They relied on something that looks almost invisible until you understand it: a system. Container science, handling discipline, route engineering, temperature management. These were not lucky survivors. They were logistical experts solving a problem that modern travelers with all their technology still struggle to understand. But before we can see what they did, we need to understand what they were fighting against. Why does water go bad in the first place? In modern life, water seems stable. Turn on a tap, fill a bottle, drink it whenever you want. But strip away refrigeration and sealed containers, and water becomes shockingly fragile. Heat is the first enemy. When temperatures climb, microbial life that might remain dormant in cool water begins to multiply. Bacteria, algae, and other organisms that were present in tiny, harmless numbers can bloom into populations large enough to cause illness. The water does not look different at first. It might not even smell different, not immediately. But the invisible change is already underway, and once it reaches a certain point, there is no going back. Then there are the containers themselves. Every vessel has a relationship with the liquid it holds. Untreated leather can leach oils and organic compounds. Clay can absorb flavors from previous contents. Gourds carry traces of the plant they once were. Over time, the interior surfaces of any container can develop biofilms, thin layers of microbial growth that cling to the walls and seed fresh contamination every time the vessel is refilled. Sunlight adds another dimension of damage. Ultraviolet rays do not just warm water. They can trigger chemical changes and accelerate the growth of certain algae. Even the simple act of opening a container introduces oxygen, which shifts the taste and can feed aerobic bacteria. And then there is human error. Dirty hands plunging into a shared water supply. Cups passed from mouth to mouth, each one leaving behind traces of saliva. Backwash from drinking directly from the container. Every point of contact is a potential doorway for contamination. In a desert caravan, where dozens of people might share a common water reserve, these small infractions could multiply into a crisis within days. The water would not announce its danger. It would simply wait for the weakest member of the group to drink deeply and discover the truth too late. This is what desert caravans were fighting. Not just thirst, not just heat, but an invisible war against decay, contamination, and time itself. And their weapons were far more sophisticated than most people imagine. The first line of defense was the container. Consider the waterskin. Most historical waterskins were made from the hide of goats or sheep, treated through a process that varied by region but followed similar principles. The hide was cleaned, the hair removed, and the skin was often tanned using natural substances, plant-based tannins. Smoke, or other agents that helped preserve the leather and reduce bacterial growth on its surface. Some traditions involved rubbing the interior with oils or resins, creating a thin barrier between the water and the raw hide. Others smoked the skin over specific woods, imparting antimicrobial properties that modern science now recognizes. The result was a flexible, portable container that was far from perfect. Water stored in untreated skins often took on a distinctive taste, but that resisted spoilage better than an untreated vessel ever could. The trade-offs were constant. A heavily treated skin might keep water safer but give it a flavor that turned the stomach. A lightly treated skin might taste better but allow faster contamination. Every choice carried consequences. And caravans learned to prepare their skins carefully, often rinsing them repeatedly before a journey to wash out the strongest flavors and settle the leather into a state that balanced safety with palatability. This was not guesswork. It was accumulated knowledge, refined over generations. Clay and ceramic vessels offered different advantages. The porous nature of unglazed clay meant that a thin layer of water was constantly seeping through the walls and evaporating on the outer surface. This evaporation drew heat away from the remaining water inside, producing a cooling effect that could lower the temperature several degrees below the ambient air, a form of natural refrigeration that required no ice. No fuel, nothing but the physics of evaporation. The cooler the water, the slower the microbial growth. It was not sterilization, but it was a meaningful break on the decay that heat accelerated. But clay had weaknesses too. It was heavier than leather, more fragile, and required careful packing to survive the jostling of camel transport. Glazed ceramics sealed better and resisted leaching but lost the cooling advantage of porosity. Some cultures split the difference, using porous outer vessels wrapped in wet cloth, or combining clay containers with leather covers for added protection. The point was never to find a perfect solution. It was to stack imperfect solutions together until the combination held. Gourds offered yet another option. Hollowed and dried, they were lightweight, sealed well against air exposure, and their natural structure resisted many contaminants. Some cultures lined gourds with wax or plant resins, creating an interior coating that prevented the water from interacting with the gourd's walls. These vessels were prized for their ability to keep water tasting clean, though they were also more delicate and required careful selection and preparation. And then there were the heavy-duty containers vessels lined with pitch, beeswax, or tree resins that created nearly waterproof seals. These were often used for long-term storage or for the most critical reserves. Archaeological evidence suggests these techniques were widespread across multiple desert cultures, but the container was only the beginning. What happened after the water was stored mattered just as much. Temperature control was the silent obsession of every experienced caravan leader. Think about it this way. A container of water sitting in direct sunlight in the middle of the day is essentially being cooked. The surface temperature of sand can exceed what the human body can tolerate, and the air above it is not much better. Every hour that water spends exposed to that heat is an hour when bacteria multiply, when chemical changes accelerate, when the clock ticks faster toward spoilage. The caravans knew this, not in the language of microbiology, but in the language of experience. They knew that water treated one way lasted longer than water treated another, and they built their entire schedule around that knowledge. Night travel was common across many desert routes. Moving under the stars meant cooler air, cooler water, and less strain on both humans and animals. The water containers were kept shaded during the day, often buried under packs or covered with wet cloths that added another layer of evaporative cooling. When the caravan stopped to rest, the containers were positioned out of the sun, sometimes partially buried in sand that was cooler a few inches below the surface. Every choice was aimed at keeping the water as cold as possible without any means of mechanical refrigeration. But even perfectly cooled water in perfectly prepared containers can be ruined in minutes by careless handling. And this is where the caravans revealed their true sophistication. Water discipline was enforced with the seriousness of law. In many caravan traditions, the main water supply was not touched casually. Dedicated vessels were used for dipping, separate from the cups used for drinking. The person responsible for water distribution might be specifically appointed, with authority to ration and refill. Drinking directly from the main supply was forbidden. Backwash, the water that flows back into a container when someone drinks from it, was understood to be a source of contamination, even if the mechanism was not named. Hands were cleaned before handling water vessels, not with soap in the modern sense, but with sand, with rituals, with the understanding that dirty hands meant dirty water. Cooking water was often kept separate from drinking water. Water that had been exposed to more contamination risk was never returned to the drinking supply. If a vessel was suspected of spoilage, it was isolated, and the group shifted to backup supplies. There was no casual sipping, no communal canteen passed around a campfire. The water supply was treated with the reverence it deserved, as the single most critical resource for survival. These rules were not suggestions. They were survival codes enforced by leaders who understood that one careless moment could doom the entire group. Travel accounts suggest that water discipline was maintained through social pressure, through hierarchy, and sometimes through serious consequences for those who broke the rules. The margin for error was too thin to tolerate carelessness. Then there was route planning, the invisible architecture that made everything else possible. A desert, to inexperienced eyes, looks like empty space. But to an experienced caravan, it was a network of nodes, wells, oases, cisterns, seasonal water sources, places where rain collected in certain months. The route was not a straight line from departure to destination. It was a careful path threaded through these water points, calculated to ensure the caravan never traveled farther than their supplies could reach. This is what might be called water math. It was the calculation of distance, of daily consumption for humans and animals, of the weight of water versus the weight of trade goods, of the buffer needed for delays, for sandstorms, for a well that might have run dry. Every decision required this mental arithmetic, performed without instruments, based on generations of accumulated knowledge passed down through oral tradition and lived experience. Camels were central to this calculation. Their legendary ability to travel for days without drinking meant they served as a kind of mobile water buffer animals that could keep moving even as water grew scarce, buying time for the caravan to reach the next source. But camels still needed water eventually, and the amount they needed after a long dry stretch was enormous. A caravan leader had to know not just how far the next well was, but whether there would be enough water there to replenish both humans and animals. Sometimes the caravan reached a well only to face a new challenge. Refilling was not as simple as lowering a bucket. The well might be partially silted, the water murky. There might be other caravans present, each with their own needs. The refilled water might need to be settled and filtered before it was safe to store. Cloth was used to strain out sediment, letting the finer particles settle before the cleaner water was decanted into the primary vessels. This was not filtration in the modern sense. It did not eliminate bacteria, but it removed particles that could shelter microbes and accelerate spoilage. Boiling was used when possible, especially at longer stops where fuel could be gathered. Hot tea and infusions were common across many desert cultures, and part of their popularity was surely practical. Boiling water was one of the few methods that genuinely reduced microbial threats. But fuel was scarce in the deep desert, and boiling was often a luxury reserved for established camps rather than a daily practice on the move. Some traditions added other substances to water. Light amounts of salt could improve taste and, in certain concentrations, slow some forms of bacterial growth. Acidic fruit juices were sometimes used for similar purposes. Certain herbs and spices were believed to keep water fresher, and while their antimicrobial effects were likely limited, they helped with palatability, and in survival situations, drinking water that tastes acceptable means drinking enough water to stay hydrated. But here is what most people miss when they hear about these methods. None of them, individually, was a perfect solution. Waterskins leaked and added strange flavors. Clay containers broke. Evaporative cooling only worked in low humidity. Boiling required fuel that was not always available. Discipline occasionally failed. Wells were sometimes dry. The secret was not any single technique. The secret was the system. Every method stacked on top of the others. Treated containers reduced baseline contamination. Evaporative cooling slowed microbial growth. Careful handling prevented new contamination from being introduced. Route planning ensured the water only needed to last until the next resupply. Settling and filtration removed the worst sediments. Boiling addressed what it could. Each layer added a margin of safety. Together, they created a window of preservation that was just wide enough to cross the distances that needed crossing. This is what modern observers often misunderstand about historical survival. They look for the single breakthrough, the clever trick, the one innovation that made everything possible. But real survival in extreme environments rarely works that way. It is almost always a system, a web of interlocking practices, each one imperfect, each one compensating for the weaknesses of the others. The caravans were not primitive people stumbling through the desert on luck and endurance. They were sophisticated operators running complex logistics across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. And they did it for centuries. Generation after generation, refining the methods, discarding what did not work, passing down the knowledge that kept the trade routes open. The caravans that crossed the Sahara carrying gold and salt, the traders who moved spices across Arabia, the merchants linking Central Asian cities to distant markets, all of them were heirs to this accumulated wisdom. They survived not because they were tougher than modern travelers, but because they understood something that modern convenience often lets us forget. Water is not just a resource, it is a responsibility. The next time you crack open a plastic bottle without thinking, consider what it took to keep water drinkable in a world without seals, without refrigeration, without chemical treatment. Consider the discipline it required, the planning, the knowledge handed down through generations of travelers who understood that the desert does not forgive carelessness. Those caravans were not relics of a simpler time. They were masters of a complexity we have only recently been able to ignore. And in ignoring it, we have forgotten just how remarkable their achievement truly was. They turned the desert from an obstacle into a road. They carried water through fire. And they did it not with miracles, but with method.